Okay, so I want to start by thanking all the panels for making my job very easy. I was delighted, the first panel yesterday morning we started to say we need more African cases, and I agree 100%. What I want to talk about, once we get this up, I've been doing I've been working with small entrepreneurs in Africa since 2005. I worked with a number of business schools, mentoring their faculty on case writing, because I believe that the way to create jobs is to teach entrepreneurship in universities, and the way to teach entrepreneurship is to look at the local market and the local context. When you look at the educational system in Africa, I think you have a massive challenge in developing faculty over the next number of years. All the business schools, when I talk to them, the number one challenge is really where do we get the faculty, where do we get the PhDs, where do we get people who can teach. Also when I talk to small companies, basically when I talk to the private sector and when I talk to students, there are a number of things that come out. The first thing is that the teaching is too theoretical. Too much theory, not enough practical things, not enough relevance. Not enough soft skills, not enough teamwork, and as a result of this, many graduates don't find a good job. Many are even unemployed. This does not just apply to Africa. If I do the same thing in Europe, you get more or less the same picture. The students complain that it's too theoretical. The companies who want to employ the students agree about the same, and it's not enough emphasis on the soft skills. So, I wanted to talk about cases. I think cases is part of the solution. It's not the solution to everything, but it's part of the solution. And it's really, in my opinion, a low-hanging fruit solution. There's no excuse for not doing this when you go back to your schools in a few days. This is about me. I've been mentoring, I think, about 100 cases in Africa. I've been mentoring mentors, and also I work as an African editor of the Emerald Journal. When you look at the challenge in Africa, in my opinion, if you want to be a good case writer, you should be a good case teacher. And if you want to be a good case teacher, most likely you should have been a student exposed to a number of cases. Like if you do an MBA, you do 300-400 cases. If you're not educated outside of Africa, it's highly unlikely that you were exposed to these cases, because case teaching is fairly new. So you start kind of with a disadvantage. You were not exposed to case teaching, cases as a student. That makes it more difficult for you to teach cases, and it makes it also more difficult for you to write cases. So I think that's it's a disadvantage. It does not mean we shouldn't try to do this. So I want to talk about what can we do to make sure that we get more African cases and more high-quality African cases. There are 3 golden rules of case teaching that some of you may like, others may not like. The first one is that not all the teaching is done by the teacher, and not all the learning is done by the student. For some people, this is fantastic. And it's really one of the reasons I decided to go into academia. I learn as much from my students as they learn from me. For some faculty, not in your school, but you may have heard of other schools where you have old-fashioned lecturers who feel that they have all the answers, they cannot learn from the students. This may be threatening. So not everybody will become a case teacher. You need to have an open mind and realize that you can learn from the students as much as they can learn from you. A case typically has no single correct answer. There are definitely wrong answers, but there may be more than one correct answer. And again, in a system where people are expecting the faculty, the professor to have all the answers, all the correct answers, this can be a little bit frustrating. So again, you need to be prepared to tell the class at the end of the class that there's no single correct answer, there's more than one possible outcome. And for some faculty members, this is fantastic. Others may feel a bit uneasy about it. And finally, there's no correct approach to teaching cases. Everybody has their own style. You just need to experiment and find what works for me and just go ahead. So, the case method is one way of learning. It's not the only one. The traditional one in universities is about lecturing. Lecturing is a very good way of transferring content and knowledge, but it has its limitations. The case method is actually very flexible. You can use it for a number of things. including what I think is very important, the critical thinking. Again, when I talk to companies about business school graduates in Africa and other parts of the world, the critical thinking part is what's missing. That's what they're looking for. You don't learn that from lecturing. The cases, I think, it's one way of learning it. It's not the only way, but it's definitely one approach. So, cases are flexible. The way cases can be used, you can use it as an application of theory or framework. This is a very typical way for me. I teach in, I do mainly executive education. I teach in 4-hour blocks most of the time. And in one of these blocks, I would spend 1 hour introducing some theory or some framework. The next hour would be apply it to the case, usually in smaller breakout groups. So people try to see how can we apply this framework to the specific case. You have plenary discussion where you compare and contrast the different approaches. And the fourth part is how do we generalize? Because a case study is a sample of one. A good case study is one where we can generalize to a number of different settings. And the students go away finding that this framework is useful in this kind of context and can be used in a number of situations. It's also a way of building theory and frameworks. So for example, if you teach entrepreneurship, there's no, in my opinion, no really good theory about entrepreneurship. But if you do 5 or 10 cases on entrepreneurship, the students can start to put this together in a way that you start to create a theory. So a number of cases can lead to a theory. Analytical and communication skills. Many cases are about comparing and contrasting two different situations, especially I would say leadership cases. A typical good leadership session is to have a case about two different cases about two different leaders with very different leadership style, and you compare and contrast and try to come to a conclusion which method is the best and in what context, which also helps the critical thinking. But most of the cases are about making a decision. So when you read the case, it's about, let's say, an entrepreneur who is about to make a decision that is not obvious. When the students read the case, I always tell them, you need to read the case, you need to come to class and be prepared to take a stand. What would you do in this situation? And basically, a number of things can happen. So the students realize that someone sitting next to them, with exactly the same case, exactly the same background, came to a different conclusion. So now we argue. You try to convince the other students that your solution is a better one. Maybe you're successful, maybe not. If you're successful, you still both of you learn. Or the other student tries to convince you that they have a better solution. And again, both of you learn. But the most typical outcome is that at the end, we all agree to disagree. You still learn. And the key thing is we always disagree with respect. We respect that two people with the same information, but most likely biased by different background, different experience, come to a different conclusion in the same situation. And you realize that I still believe my approach is the best, but I do appreciate that someone else can have a different opinion, and I respect them for that. This is, again, this is what the case method is about, and it's, I think, one of the key things in critical thinking. Okay, so another problem, can you make a career writing cases? It was good enough to put Harvard Business School on the map. But today, in many academic environments, it is research. But in many schools, it's not really appreciated as research. And I think it's up to the universities to change this. So it's up to you as deans or whatever your role to make sure that this becomes part of the tenure process, but the annual evaluation. If it's not part of this, I don't think we have a chance of getting cases into the classroom, and we don't have a chance of getting people to write cases. Very important, and that's up to you. There are case competitions and awards. I will talk about this. But basically, as a faculty, you want to be recognized. One way of being recognized is to have your case published in a journal, a refereed journal. Even better recognition is that people at other business schools actually adopt your case and start to use it. And I think the ultimate award is when you win a case award, because this is a competition They are experts who evaluate the case and decide that your case was the best of the submitted one. This is definitely something you want on your CV. I will talk a little bit more about this later, but it's not about the case. In a case competition, the teaching note is the important part, because that shows you have thought about the learning process, you have designed and written the case in a way that you will get the maximum impact in the classroom. It's typically the #1 weakness. So me as a case mentor and editor of a journal, the teaching note is almost always the weakest point. So I will come back a little bit later and talk about what are some of the mistakes. Okay, I will skip this because it's kind of obvious. I will talk about case writing. So first of all, I have mentored, I think, close to 100 African cases. I tell the case writers, these are the principles you need to respect, and I think I can count on my hand the number of things they have actually done what I told them. So I want to one more time repeat what are the correct approach. The first step is to decide, what do I want the students to learn? So if you teach for 90 minutes, 2 hours, whatever, in the last 5 to 10 minutes of a class session, these are the things they should take away, and these are the things they should discover. I should not tell them at the end, these are the important points, they should discover that during the session. This is the first step, because this determines everything else you do. After that, you identify and contact a company that would be a good illustration of these learning points. And this was brought up also yesterday morning. You need to prepare for the visit, because usually you only get one chance to make an impression, and you want that to be a good impression. So you need to know everything about the company that you can find out, and then you need to explain the case writing process. This is about getting the buy-in. If you don't get the buy-in from whoever is the decision maker, don't even start the case, because it's usually a waste of time. The way it works is that at the end of the process, once you deliver your case to the company, they will sign, we accept that you can use this case. It's now in the public domain, you can use it in the classroom. And the company has the right to sign off or not to sign off. So nothing will be published or made public without their approval. It has happened to me a number of times that the company said in the end, no, we don't like this. More typically, they say, we don't like this part. We will censor this because this is sensitive information. Or they may say, it's okay, but we don't want to be identified by name. You have to disguise the name, possibly the country, possibly the industry. And actually, just as a funny example, we once wrote a case on a Swiss bank that did something that they were not completely proud of. So they said, okay, you can publish this case, but we want you to disguise it. So we rewrote the case as happening in Hong Kong. We were teaching this case in one of the sessions where participants from the bank were in the audience, and after the session they came up and told us this could only happen in Hong Kong. So they didn't even recognize their own company. So it's possible to do these things, but basically you tell the company up front, you decide at the end. I once wrote a case that I think would have been the most amazing case I ever wrote. It was about an internal conflict, again in the bank, but in the end they said, no, we don't want this in the public domain. And it was a listed company, so it was a bit more sensitive than for the companies. So the risk you take is that at the end of the process, they don't accept this. In order to minimize that risk, you really need to get the buy-in. You need to convince them that, well, you're not going to misuse the information. The other problem, which many times is even bigger, is what's in it for us. So some companies may be generous and say, we want to help the world, improve university education, we will make this investment. But usually the question you get, or even if you don't get it, answer it nevertheless, how much time will be based on this exercise. I usually tell the companies that I need to talk to maybe 5, 6, 7 people, count about 1 hour per person, plus the key contact, which is usually the CEO, maybe 2-3 hours in total, 2-3 meetings times 3 hours. But tell them upfront, this is a time commitment we expect from you. In addition, we expect you to provide data if it's relevant for the case. Just make sure that you have a clear contract. This is what we expect from you. You need to create a win-win situation. So what will the company get in return for this? Many times companies have done something they are proud of. So they want exposure. They want PR. They want to get their name on the map, and that's fine. In other situations, maybe they don't really care about the PR, but many times they value your inputs, kind of free consulting. You will give your opinion about what are they doing right, what are they doing maybe not so well. And what I always do, which is sometimes very much appreciated, when I teach the case for the first time, I invite them to come to class, sit in the back and listen to the class discussion, and they usually get ideas. Maybe not solutions, but they get ideas. So those are the things you need to provide to them. You need to provide confidentiality, absolutely. You need to provide some limitation on the time they're going to waste and something in addition what they will get out of this case. And if you don't really get the full commitment, I learned over the years, I stop at that point. I don't continue because you can easily waste a couple of weeks of time and in the end you don't really have a good case. You collect the information, you talk to the key players, and then very important, you write the teaching note before you write the case. So you have done the interviews. I always insist, have a teaching note. This is the way, these are the questions I intend to ask. These are kind of the answers I expect, and these are the learning points. Because if that's clear, it's very easy to write the case. You put exactly the information in the case that's needed to answer the questions, nothing more, nothing less. My cases, someone told me, all my cases are 6 pages long. If you don't have a clear teaching note in mind when you write a case, they end up being 25 pages long. And that's usually not that's usually a sign of a case that's not really that great. Actually, my personal rule of thumb is that the teaching note should be twice as long as a case. And when we announce the case winner a little bit later, that case is 10 pages, the teaching note is 22 pages. That to me is a sign of a good case. What we tend to get in many case competitions and for the journal, cases that are 25 pages long and the teaching note that's 1.5 page. The students had to read 25 pages for average, let's say non-native speaker, that takes about 2-3 hours. And then the class discussion based on the teaching note is 10 minutes. Clearly not thought through as a process. So the teaching note is the most important part in terms of the academic criteria. Then you write the case and get the feedback and the clearance and teach and refine it. So again, in the journal, many cases are submitted without being taught a single time. There are lots of bugs when you do that. When you teach it the first time, there are a number of things you realize. For example, you may ask a question that to you is obvious. Because you have spent 2 weeks with the company, you know everything, but the students cannot answer it based on what you have in the case. So then you need to go back and fix the case. It should be a fair question, but because you know so much more, to you it's obvious, to them it's not. The other thing that may happen is that the students actually have a much better answer than you thought of. They bring ideas that you didn't even think of, and again, that's a very good way of refining the teaching note. So if you want to submit cases to journals, teach them 2-3 times, refine them, fix the bugs, and you will have a much better case at the end. Typical examples. It's almost always about the teaching note. It could be about the protagonist, but there are 6 golden rules of a good case. The first one is that it's not just the story. So first-time case writers, very typically, they write it as an academic article. Introduction, blah, 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 conclusion. And it can be a very nice story, it could be a very nice article in Business Week, but it's not the case. The case is about presenting a dilemma that should be discussed in the classroom, and the solution and conclusion should be in the teaching note, if there is one. Of course, it should be an important issue and it should be a relevant issue. This is kind of obvious. It should be written in a way that it kind of there's a discovery. Students walk out of a class realizing that there's something in there that they didn't think of, and that's the way they learn, and that's the way they remember. So the learning points should be discovered by the students during the classroom discussion. That's the way you reinforce the learning. Controversial helps. The way we learn is by disagreeing. Anytime two people disagree, we have an opportunity to learn. And if you make a case controversial, we have a higher chance of disagreement. The other thing that helps a lot is diversity. If you have a very diverse class, you don't need to worry about disagreement. It happens naturally. So that's absolutely fantastic. Contrast and comparison. So try to provide different opinions, try to compare different solutions, and very important, without being able to generalize, a case study basically remains a sample of one. That doesn't really help people a lot. Sometimes it's interesting, but really, here it's about what can we take away from this that will help us in our careers for the next 20 years. So, I have actually lots of slides that go into painful detail about this. I will give you the slides. I don't want to talk about this here because you can all read. I'm here to learn from you. So let's have a discussion. Let's have some questions about case writing, case teaching, case journals before we announce the award. Yes.
Well, in your last presentations, items, you mentioned the good qualities of case studies. One is that should be controversial, and the other one, it should provide useful generalizations or conclusions. Do you think these two items conflict each other?
I don't see how they would. I mean, controversial means that there should not be one single correct answer. Because you want to kind of discover the solution by arguing, and if you walk into the class and everybody in the class has the same answer, I don't think it's a good case. The generalization may be that there's not one single correct answer. But to me, generalization is that, I mean, let's say you do a case on segmentation for fast-moving consumer goods. Generalization in that case would be, can this tool be applied to B2B businesses or to service companies? That kind of generalization. So it's about teaching a framework that can be applied to other contexts. So I may not answer your question, but I don't really see a conflict between these. And it's really up to you as a case writer to write it in a way. Actually, I forgot, there are a couple of other mistakes that maybe I should mention about the teaching note. So typical mistakes with the teaching note is that there's not enough information to answer the question. Which means that the only person who can teach the case is the one who wrote it, because they have that information. It's very typical. And if you spend a couple of weeks or days, whatever, with a company, you will know so much more than anybody else. So you kind of become blinded, you don't see this. That's why you need to test the case. The other example is that the answer is too simple. You ask something and the students just go to line number 5 and the answer is written there. So you need to find this balance between, the answer should not be directly in the case, but there should be a way of discovering the answer by combining different pieces of the case. The other mistake, which I see a lot, is that And this is not good planning of the teaching. There's a case, a description of an industry, and in the teaching note they say, apply this framework like SWOT analysis of Porter's 5 forces. And then you apply Porter's 5 forces, and so what? I mean, you check the box, you have applied the framework, but there's no conclusion based on this. A framework is only useful if it gives you insights. It gives you an answer to something going on in the case. There's no reason to write a case just for the sake of applying a framework. But lots of people do that. And I think especially people who have kind of a lecturing background, they want to show these are the mechanics of applying a framework. But if there's no so what, there's no point in doing it. And trust me, there are lots of cases like this.
I've been dean for several years at the College of Business Administration in Ethiopia. And I've been lucky enough, I'm one of those few luckiest persons, where the Harvard University wanted to share its experience with African universities. And there were about 30 African university teachers try to learn about the adaptation of case studies for learning. And this was in 1975. And this was funded by Ford Foundation and held in Nairobi at a retreat. And this is the first time that case writing came to Africa. Now, one of the difficulties was that the case writing has to be contextualized to the local needs. But there were no local entrepreneurs or corporations to try to write the case. So that was the first time that was stuck. Now, on the other hand, from what you're telling us, and I'm glad that Gibbs has picked this up, that there is now what you call a renaissance to try to bring this case writing as a teaching method as well to apply it to business schools. But to what an extent, for example, in your teaching of the case studies, have you taken this institutional memory and what has happened? And what could be learned from there? Now, one thing that I'm finding around here is that people are picking this as if they are discovering new to the situation. Colleges of businesses in Africa that has been established have already had some experience. So what was wrong with them? We must learn from there. And I agree with you in this sense that the hardest part about case writing is not that you can't find a case, there is an interesting thing, but the teaching note.
Yeah.
And from my experience has been, is the preparation of the teaching note failure that have made the case writings in Africa since 1970 not to come up to par. I don't know to what an extent you're familiar with this, and therefore we should take institutional memories to try to examine what has happened.
Yes.
Thank you.
So let me start by saying the teaching note is always a challenge, not just in Africa. It's throughout. Because it's, the reason is that most people, when they write the first case, they kind of think of this as writing an article. So they write a story, they don't think about what is really the learning behind it. Specifically about Ethiopia, I mean, if you come from kind of a socialist background, you don't have, at the time you didn't have these companies. You can write cases on the public sector. Today, there are plenty of cases on social entrepreneurship. So I think there are plenty of opportunities out there. But yes, it's a lot easier today than it was in the 1970s, for sure.
Claire Beswick, I'm at the Wits Business School. And I just wanted to make a comment and ask a question. Your characteristics of a good case up there of providing currently useful generalizations. Just for you to know, I head up the Case Study Writing Center at the Wits Business School. It's not necessarily that the generalizations are actually in the case itself. The discussion will generate those generalizations. In fact, if the generalizations are hidden and not clear in the case, that makes for a much better case discussion. And I think that might be where some of the confusion comes from. You can have controversy and debate, generated by the case, and then you bring away from that discussion the generalizations that are useful. Am I right there, Leif?
And let me actually clarify. I think it's more about you should select a company. You should not select a company that's so unique that you will never find a situation where you can. It should be a situation where you know that you can take this and apply it to other situations. So it's more about selecting the company.
Fine. And then I wanted to ask a question. You were talking about getting cases published, and the only place that I know of where peer-reviewed case studies are published is the Emerging Markets Case Collection. Are there others that we could know about?
There are a number of case journals. They tend to be specialized by function. So I'm also on the editorial board of a journal by the Institute of Management Accountants in the US. And what they do is they publish cases specifically for accounting. So there are a number of those. For emerging markets, this is the only one really I'm aware of.
My name is Kobe from UGBS, University of Ghana Business School. Now, my question is, when don't you need a clearance? Because obviously, every bad story, companies would not give you the clearance. And myself and my colleague, we co-teach one program, Financial Services Marketing. And usually what we do is at the beginning of the semester, we ask students to write their experiences in terms of receiving services from financial institutions. And the idea is we're looking at service recovery, how companies actually recover from bad services and things like that. Now, clearly, if you have to go to the company, most of them are not going to give you clearance. Yet, you have quite a number of customers complaining on Facebook, and you have a trail of people complaining about them, about services. So clearly, the jury is out there. So why do you want to go and ask them, we have this very bad story and therefore you need clearance from them?
You do have some legal exposure if you don't get the clearance. If you decide to write a case without getting the clearance, the first thing you need to do is you need to use public sources and you need to document it very carefully. So everything that you put in the case, you need to have a documented source just in case you get sued. It's very important, but the real problem is that you will never get the insights. Even if people complain on Facebook, you never get the other side of the story. There are cases written based on public information. There are even good cases, but in my experience, if you don't get a chance to talk to people, it's not likely to be a really good case. I once wrote a case in the Philippines where the company said that we will never release this case, but we are happy to talk to you about what happened. So they gave me all the stories and they told me that you write this case based on public information, these are the correct sources. These are the press clips, use this and this, and that will be the story. But they would not want their name on the case. We also mentioned yesterday morning that there's not enough failure cases. Failure cases are fantastic, but companies are usually not proud of them. They are not going to sign the release. So if some company provides customer service that's not so good, they are not likely to sign off. If you write a success story, it's much more likely. It is a dilemma. Just make sure that everything is well documented. And you do have some legal exposure, because even if it's well documented, you could still be sued.
There are many reasons for this to be a very grateful moment for AABS, and I want to say that I thank Emerald for being a partner on case writing and the case prize for a number of years, and I'm very happy that you have the commitment that we are going to work around the pricing of cases, which I think is an issue. What is secondly a very nice moment is that the CEO of the company of the case is equally present, and I'm going to ask that he would sort of give us a few words about what the company learned from this case, and of course I'll ask the same by the case winner, but I would like to hear from the company why you engage in it and in what is the advantage and what is the learning, and etc. etc. So it gives you a few minutes to think about it, isn't it? And so that you're not really taken by surprise. And third, last but not least, I even not only commit to submit the case, I'll commit to submit again the winning case, since I'm very, very happy and proud that the case that won is indeed a GSB UCT student, I should say, participant with her teacher. So I have the pleasure to invite Mariam Kassim, who wrote the case together with Linda Ronnie, to come down and accept the prize, after which I'll ask you to say a few words. And then, of course, if you would like to say a few words, I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you so much. You had a first. Oh.
Thank you, Walter. This is really testing my public speaking impromptu skills, as I was told that I just had to come up and smile. But thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. The case that I wrote was a submission as part of my final dissertation for the MBA at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, and it was an extremely interesting experience. I'm sad that my supervisor, Dr. Linda Ronnie, couldn't be here today. She's actually in the US submitting another paper. But we had a really, really interesting journey in putting the case together. And to anyone out there wanting to do a case, I'd say it's definitely worth something looking into. Supervision is very, very important, but I think for me it was also just finding an organization that saw value that could come from a case, and to that I'm ever so thankful to Vodacom, and in particular the CEO, Shamil Jusuf, who opened the doors, granted me unrestricted access to information, because I think that's critical as well. But also the opportunity to look within different parts of the business, but different regions as well. So the case was set in South Africa, but it also looked at the success in Tanzania as well. So the case was on M-Pesa, and it really looked at the challenges that organizations face when trying to implement one business model which is successful in one market into another market, and the recommendations were how important it is to understand market conditions, but also how to understand the needs of the customer when looking to expand new products into new markets. So to the GSB, the MBA was a phenomenal learning experience, great support on teaching cases. So thanks, Walter, for that opportunity. And to Emerald, thank you very much for, we submitted it. We really weren't sure whether we'd win, so it was very exciting when we did win, but also a lovely prize to do some shopping. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and really congratulations, Mariam. It's really been fantastic to see that you've been honored for the work that you've done. And I mean, I was impressed with your report, and we are using it internally. So, you know, I think thank you for the valuable input that you've given us, and that will help us in our journey in implementing M-Pesa in South Africa. Maybe just a little bit about why we decided to do this. Mariam approached us and said, look, I would like to do this case study. And we'd actually had a false start on M-Pesa in South Africa. And she said, look, I'd like to write a report. And she did a lot of field work, went up to Tanzania, where we've had a very successful implementation of it, and also in Kenya, where we've really had a successful implementation. Looked at the different environments, what the recipes for success were. And then in a report looked at how that could be adapted to the South African environment and what management should consider. So the report is actually quite insightful in that it takes the it puts itself in the hands of the new incoming person in charge of mobile money, and basically then makes a number of recommendations to him of what he should look out for, why the product had a false start before, and what really were the recipes of success and how to adapt those recipes of success into a different environment with a different banking infrastructure and so on. So very insightful report, and definitely, definitely something that we'll be using internally. So, Mariam, congratulations again, and thank you to all of you for giving us the opportunity, and it's been an honor to be part of it.
Thank you.